a quiet librarian, a woman on the run, and a chance encounter that changes everything. When Michael offers Harper shelter in his library, he has no idea how deeply their lives will intertwine. Haunted by her past and skeptical of kindness, Harper begins a journey of healing, while Michael finds himself confronting regrets he thought he'd buried. As challenges mount and unexpected bonds form, their shared courage ignites a story of redemption, resilience, and hope. What happens when two broken paths lead to something brighter? The rain drizzled steadily over the small town of Millfield, where Michael Hart, a reserve librarian in his late 30s, locked the library's main entrance for the evening. The gray sky mirrored his mood, as it often did in these quiet moments. The library was his sanctuary, a haven of order in a world he found overwhelming. But tonight, something felt different, as if the rain carried with it a quiet urgency. Michael pulled his jacket tighter, preparing to cross the street when he noticed someone hunched over by the library's steps. A young woman, her hair plastered to her face by the rain, was struggling to wrestle a large suitcase into a sheltered corner. The suitcase had seen better days. It seems frayed, and one will barely holding on. He hesitated. Millfield was a close-knit town where strangers weren't common, let alone people in obvious distress. He debated whether to intervene. His life had always been one of avoidance, conflict, messiness, and emotional entanglements were things he stayed far from. Yet something about her, the way she hunched over the suitcase like it was the last thing she owned, pulled at him. He stepped closer. "Excuse me," he called, his voice tentative. The woman straightened and turned sharply, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" she snapped. Her voice was firm, but edged with exhaustion. Michael held up his hands. "Sorry, I didn't mean to bother you. I just saw you struggling. Do you need help?" She stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to gauge his intentions. Finally, she sighed and turned back to her suitcase. "It's fine. I can handle it." Rainwater pooled around her feet, and Michael noticed her sneakers were soaked through, the fabric dark and heavy. He felt a pang of discomfort, realizing she had been out here for hours. "You can come inside to warm up," he offered cautiously. "The library's closed, but there's a bench in the lobby." The woman glanced at him again, her expression softening just slightly. "You're not supposed to let people in after hours, are you?" He shrugged. "Probably not, but it's better than sitting in the rain." After a pause, she nodded. Michael unlocked the door and held it open for her. She stepped inside, dragging the suitcase with a groan of effort. The library's warmth enveloped them as they entered. The woman settled on the bench near the entrance, her suitcase positioned protectively by her side. Michael walked to the back room and returned with a towel from the staff supplies. "Here," he said, handing it to her. She hesitated before taking it. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice softer now. Michael sat on the edge of the reception desk, unsure of what to say next. She seemed content to dry her hair in silence, and he didn't want to pry. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. "Do you have somewhere to go tonight?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. She froze mid-motion, the towel paused against her hair. "I'll figure it out," she said after a moment, her voice tight. Michael could sense her discomfort, so he changed the subject. "I'm Michael. By the way, I work here." She lowered the towel, giving him a cautious look. "Harper," she said simply. "Nice to meet you, Harper," he replied, though he felt the weight of her guardedness. As the minutes passed, the library's ticking clock seemed louder in the quiet space. Harper busied herself by rearranging items in her suitcase, but Michael noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "Are you hungry?" he asked suddenly. Harper looked up, surprised. "What?" "There's a diner across the street. I can grab something for you," he offered. Her eyes narrowed. "Why?" Michael blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I just thought you might need it. That's all." She studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "A sandwich would be nice." "Thank you." Michael grabbed his coat and dashed across the street, the rain still relentless. Inside the diner, the warm scent of grilled cheese and coffee greeted him. He ordered 2 sandwiches to go, hesitating before adding a side of soup. Harper didn't seem the type to ask for more than she needed, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that she might appreciate it. When he returned to the library, Harper was sitting with her arms crossed, staring blankly at the window. She turned as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Here," he said, handing her the bag. She opened it and paused, her brow furrowing as she pulled out the soup. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Michael said quickly. "I thought you might like it." For a moment, she said nothing, her fingers gripping the container. Then she muttered, "Thanks." As Harper ate in silence, Michael busied himself with straightening books on the nearby shelves. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to linger. Maybe it was her silence, which wasn't hostile, but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Or maybe it was the way she seemed so small against the vastness of the library, like a bird seeking refuge from a storm. "You don't have to stay, you know," Harper said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Michael turned, startled. "What?" "You've done enough," she said, gesturing to the food. "You don't have to keep babysitting me." He hesitated. "I wasn't trying to babysit. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Harper's eyes softened for a moment, but she quickly looked away. "I'm not your problem, Michael. You don't even know me." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But everyone deserves a little kindness, don't you think?" Her expression flickered with something Michael couldn't quite place out, perhaps, or maybe longing. She didn't respond, instead focusing on finishing her meal. As the evening stretched into night, Michael realized he needed to close up for good. "You can stay here until the rain lets up," he said, standing. Harper nodded, her voice low. "Thanks for everything." Michael nodded and walked to the door, hesitating before stepping out into the rain. He glanced back to see Harper settling on the bench, her shoulders no longer as tense. Walking home, Michael felt an unfamiliar mix of emotions: concern, curiosity, and something resembling hope. He didn't know Harper's story or why she seemed so reluctant to accept help. But he knew one thing for sure. Her presence had stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The rain fell harder, but Michael barely noticed. For the first time in years, he felt like he'd done something that mattered. The next morning, Michael arrived at the library earlier than usual, a strange sense of anticipation tugging at him. He had spent much of the night wondering about Harper, where she had come from, why she seemed so alone, and whether she had found somewhere safe to stay. As he unlocked the library doors, he glanced at the bench where she had sat the night before. It was empty, save for a discarded coffee cup that someone had left behind. Michael sighed, trying to push the thought of her out of his mind. She was a stranger, after all. His life was quiet and orderly, and she was a momentary disruption. But even as he told himself to forget her, he couldn't. By mid-morning, the library was alive with its usual rhythm: the hum of computers, the soft shuffling of pages, and the murmured conversations of patrons. Michael had just finished restocking a shelf when he heard the unmistakable sound of a suitcase rolling across the floor. He turned, and there she was. Harper stood near the entrance, her damp suitcase at her side, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked around hesitantly, as if debating whether to stay or leave. "Harper," Michael said, walking over. Her shoulders stiffened at the sound of her name, but she didn't turn away. "Hey," she said, her voice subdued. "You came back," he said, relief coloring his tone. She shrugged, figured it was better than wandering around. Michael hesitated, unsure of what to say. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her posture slumped as if carrying an invisible weight. "Did you get any rest last night?" Harper shook her head. "Not much. Parks aren't exactly known for their comfort." The image of her trying to sleep on a park bench made something twist in Michael's chest. "You could have stayed here longer," he said softly. She glanced at him, her expression wary. "I didn't want to overstay my welcome." Michael gestured toward the lobby bench where she had sat the night before. "You're always welcome here." Harper gave him a skeptical look, but didn't argue. She pulled her suitcase to the bench and sat down, her hands resting on her knees. Michael noticed that her shoes were still wet, the soles worn thin. "Stay here," he said suddenly, disappearing into the back room. When he returned, he held a pair of socks he had brought as an emergency spare on rainy days. "These might be a little big, but they're dry," he said, holding them out to her. Harper stared at the socks for a long moment before taking them. "Thanks," she said quietly, slipping off her soaked sneakers. Her toes were red from the cold, and Michael had to look away to stop himself from saying something overly concerned. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know," she said as she pulled on the socks. "Doing what?" "Helping me," Harper said, her tone sharper now. "I'm not your responsibility." Michael sat down across from her, meeting her guarded gaze. "I'm not trying to make you my responsibility. I just don't like the thought of you out there with nowhere to go." Harper scoffed, but it lacked real conviction. "People don't just help for no reason." "Maybe they do," Michael countered. "Maybe they should." For a while, neither of them spoke. Harper stared at the floor, her hands clasped tightly together, while Michael tried to think of something to say that wouldn't scare her off. Finally, Harper broke the silence. "Why do you care?" Michael hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe because I've seen what happens when no one does." Her eyes flicked up to his, searching for something. "What do you mean?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "My brother," he began. "He struggled a lot after losing his job. I didn't know how to help him, so I didn't. We drifted apart, and now I haven't seen him in years." Harper's expression softened, the sharp edges of her skepticism dulling. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low. "It's not your fault," Michael said quickly. "But I think about him a lot. Wonder if things would have been different if I'd just reached out more. Maybe I see a little of him in you." Harper looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. "It's not the same," she said. "I'm not some lost cause you can fix." "I don't think you're a lost cause," Michael said firmly. "I think you're someone who deserves a chance." Harper didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. The hours passed, and Michael went about his work while Harper stayed on the bench, flipping through a book she'd taken from a nearby shelf. Every now and then, he caught her glancing at him, her expression thoughtful. By the time the sun began to set, the library had emptied out, leaving the two of them alone. Michael approached Harper cautiously. "Do you have a plan for tonight?" She shrugged. "Same as last night, I guess." Michael frowned. "You can't keep sleeping outside. It's not safe." "I've been doing it for months," Harper said flatly. "Months?" Michael repeated, stunned. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Since I left my ex." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. "I'm sorry," Michael said softly. Harper shook her head. "Don't be. It was my choice to leave." Michael hesitated, then asked, "What about shelters?" Harper's laugh was bitter. "Shelters aren't what people think, especially not for women. It's safer out here." Michael felt a wave of frustration not at Harper, but at the world that had failed her. "You can't stay out there forever," he said. "And what do you suggest?" Harper asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Michael didn't have an answer. He knew offering her his couch would cross a line, but letting her go back to the streets felt equally wrong. Finally, he said, "You can stay here a little longer, at least until we figure something out." Harper's eyes narrowed. "Why do you keep doing this?" "Because everyone deserves a little kindness," Michael said simply. For the first time, Harper didn't argue. She stayed quiet as Michael locked up for the night, pulling her suitcase closer as if it were a shield. "Good night, Harper," he said, pausing at the door. "Good night, Michael," she murmured, her voice barely audible. As Michael walked home, the weight of the day settled on him. He didn't know why Harper had appeared in his life or what he could do to help her. But one thing was clear. He wasn't ready to walk away. The next morning, Michael arrived at the library feeling a nervous energy he couldn't quite explain. The early rays of sunlight bathed the quiet street, but his mind was already racing with thoughts of Harper. Would she still be there? Did she trust him enough to stay? As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, he was relieved to see her curled up on the same bench, using her coat as a makeshift blanket. Her suitcase sat upright beside her, as if standing guard. For a moment, Michael hesitated, not wanting to disturb her, but as he moved to the desk, her eyes fluttered open. "You're early," she said groggily, sitting up and brushing her hair back. "So are you," he replied with a faint smile, trying to mask the relief in his voice. Harper stretched, wincing as she did. "Not much choice when you sleep sitting up." Michael hesitated, then said, "I brought coffee. It's not much, but it might help." He set a cup on the desk near her bench. She eyed the cup, her expression unreadable, before finally reaching for it. "Thanks," she said, her voice soft. The library opened at its usual time, and the morning passed uneventfully. Harper stayed on the bench, flipping through books and occasionally glancing out the window. Michael noticed she was quieter than usual, her usual edge dulled by what seemed like exhaustion. Around lunchtime, the first signs of trouble appeared. Two regular patrons, an older woman named Mrs. Turner and a young man named Kyle, began whispering near the front desk. Michael caught snippets of their conversation, words like vagrant and freeloader, that made his stomach tighten. "Excuse me," he said, stepping closer. "Is there something I can help you with?" Mrs. Turner turned, her face tight with disapproval. "I just find it odd, Michael, that the library has become a shelter now. That woman's been here all morning." Michael felt a flare of defensiveness, but forced himself to stay calm. "She's not bothering anyone," he said. Kyle snorted. "Maybe not, but it's not exactly a good look for the library, is it? Letting someone camp out here?" Michael's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Harper stood up. "Don't worry," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "I'll leave." Michael turned to her, panic rising. "Harper, you don't have to." "It's fine," she interrupted, grabbing her suitcase. Her face was blank, but her hands trembled as she pulled the handle. "I've been enough of a problem already." By the time Michael reached the door, Harper was already halfway down the street, her suitcase wobbling behind her. He hesitated, torn between staying at the library and going after her. But something inside him, something stronger than his usual fear of confrontation, propelled him forward. He caught up with her near the corner. "Harper, wait." She stopped but didn't turn around. "Go back, Michael. I don't need you defending me." "I wasn't defending you," he said, stepping closer. "I was trying to help." Harper turned then, her eyes blazing. "Help? Do you think letting me sit in that library fixes anything? Do you think people like me want your pity?" Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. "It's not pities, Harper. I just don't want you to feel like you have to face this alone." Her expression wavered, the anger giving way to something more vulnerable. "You don't even know me," she said, her voice breaking. "Maybe not," Michael admitted. "But I know what it's like to feel like no one cares. And I know that's not something anyone should go through." Harper stared at him for a long moment before looking away. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. "Because I think everyone deserves a chance," Michael said simply. For a while, neither of them spoke. The street buzzed around them, the world oblivious to the quiet storm brewing in Harper's eyes. Finally, she sighed and looked back at him. "I don't want to go back there," she said. "Then don't," Michael replied. "Let's find somewhere else." Harper frowned. "Like where?" Michael hesitated, thinking. He remembered a diner he frequented, a small, family-run place where the staff knew him by name. "There's a diner nearby," he said. "Let's get something to eat and figure it out from there." Harper looked skeptical, but nodded. "Fine, but I'm not letting you pay for everything." Michael smiled faintly. "Deal." The diner was warm and inviting, its walls decorated with vintage signs and photographs of the town's history. The scent of coffee and freshly baked bread filled the air as they took a booth near the window. The waitress, a cheerful woman named Sandra, approached with her notepad. "Hey, Michael. Long time no sees. Who's your friend?" "This is Harper," Michael said, glancing at her. Harper gave a small nod, but didn't meet Sandra's eyes. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Harper," Sandra said warmly. "What can I get you too?" Michael ordered a sandwich and coffee, while Harper opted for soup. As Sandra walked away, Harper folded her arms on the table. "You didn't have to bring me here," she said. "I wanted to," Michael replied. "Besides, everyone deserves a hot meal now and then." Harper opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when Sandra returned, placing a small basket of warm rolls on the table. "On the house," she said with a smile. Harper stared at the basket, her expression unreadable. "Why?" she asked quietly. Sandra chuckled. "Because you look like you could use it. No strings attached." For a moment, Harper didn't move. Then she reached for a roll, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they ate, Michael noticed Harper relaxing, her shoulders losing some of their tension. She even smiled faintly when Sandra cracked a joke about the diner's ancient coffee machine. When they finished, Michael leaned back in his seat. "Feel better?" Harper nodded, though her expression remained serious. Yeah, thanks for this. Michael hesitated, then asked, have you thought about what's next? Harper sighed. Not really. I've been living day to day for so long. I don't even know where to start. Michael tapped his fingers on the table, an idea forming in his mind. What if I could help you find something more stable? A job, maybe, or somewhere to stay? Harper frowned. And how exactly are you going to do that? I don't know yet, Michael admitted. But I'm willing to try if you are. They left the diner as the afternoon sun peeked through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the town. Harper walked a few steps ahead, her suitcase trailing behind her. You're stubborn, you know that, she said suddenly, glancing over her shoulder. Michael chuckled. I've been told. Harper shook her head, but didn't argue. For the first time since he had met her, Michael saw something in her eyes that looked like hope. The sun was setting as Michael and Harper walked back toward the library. The rain had cleared, leaving the streets glistening under the fading light. Harper kept her suitcase close, though her steps seemed lighter now. Michael could sense a shift in her, subtle but undeniable, as if the walls she had built around herself were beginning to crack. When they reached the library, Harper paused outside the door. I can't stay here forever, you know, she said softly, her fingers tightening on the suitcase handle. I know, Michael replied, his voice steady. But you don't have to figure everything out tonight. Let's just take this one step at a time. Harper hesitated, then nodded. One step at a time, she echoed, though her tone was more resigned than hopeful. The library was quiet after hours, its usual hum replaced by a comforting stillness. Michael brewed a pot of coffee in the staff room and returned with 2 steaming mugs. He handed one to Harper, who had settled back on the bench. Thanks, she said, wrapping her hands around the mug. Michael sat across from her, his own coffee untouched. He studied Harper for a moment, noticing the lines of exhaustion etched into her face, the way her eyes flickered with emotions she rarely let surface. You said you've been living day to day, he began carefully. Do you mind if I ask how it got to that point? Harper stiffened, her gaze dropping to the floor. Why does it matter? Because maybe talking about it could help, Michael said. I know it's not easy, but sometimes saying it out loud makes it feel less heavy. For a long time, Harper didn't respond. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, she let out a long breath and leaned back against the wall. I used to have a life, she began, her voice quiet but steady. Not a great one, but it was mine. I worked as a waitress at a diner in the city. Nothing fancy, but it paid the bills. Michael nodded, staying silent to let her continue. Then I met Aaron, she said, her tone hardening slightly. He was charming, you know, the kind of guy who could light up a room just by walking into it. We started dating, and for a while, things were good. I thought he loved me. Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug, and Michael saw the tension in her shoulders. But then he started changing, Harper said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was little things at first, getting angry over nothing, making me feel like everything was my fault. And I let it happen because I thought it was normal, until it wasn't. Michael felt a pang of anger, not at Harper, but at the man who had hurt her. What happened? He asked gently. Harper's lips pressed into a thin line. One night, he got mad about something stupid, dinner being cold or whatever, and he hit me. I told myself it was a one-time thing, but it wasn't. It kept happening, and every time, he'd apologize, promise to change. But he never did. She paused, her eyes fixed on the coffee in her hands. I stayed for 2 years. 2 years of walking on eggshells, hoping he'd go back to being the guy I fell in love with. But he didn't. So one night, I packed a bag and left while he was out. Michael's chest tightened. That must have taken a lot of courage. Harper shrugged. Maybe. Or maybe I just got tired of being afraid. The room fell silent again, but this time, it felt like a shared quiet, as if Harper had handed Michael a piece of her burden and he was holding it with her. Where did you go? Michael asked after a while. Nowhere, Harper said with a bitter laugh. I didn't have a plan. I just ran. I stayed in shelters when I could, crashed on couches when people let me. But eventually, the couches ran out, and the shelters stopped feeling safe. She looked up at Michael, her expression guarded. And that's how I ended up here. Just another homeless woman people pretend not to see. Michael shook his head. You're more than that, Harper. You've been through so much, and you're still standing. That's not nothing. Harper let out a humorless laugh. Standing? Barely. Even barely counts, Michael said firmly. For a moment, Harper just stared at him, as if trying to figure out why he cared so much. What about you? She asked suddenly. You said you know what it's like to feel like no one cares. What did you mean by that? Michael hesitated. He hadn't planned on sharing his story, but it felt only fair after what Harper had just told him. My brother, Eric, he began. He was always the ambitious one, the one everyone expected to do great things. But when his business went under a few years ago, he started struggling. I knew he needed help, but I didn't know how to give it. So I didn't. He paused, the memory heavy in his chest. We drifted apart. He stopped calling, and I stopped trying. The last time we spoke, he told me he was moving out of state to start over. That was 3 years ago. Harper frowned. Have you tried reaching out? Michael shook his head. I wouldn't even know where to start. And even if I did, I don't think he'd want to hear from me. I let him down when he needed me most. Harper studied him, her expression softening. Sounds like you're harder on yourself than he probably ever was. Michael smiled faintly. Maybe, but it doesn't change the fact that I failed him. The two of them sat in silence for a while, the weight of their stories hanging in the air. But something about sharing their pain, about laying it bare in the quiet safety of the library, made it feel just a little lighter. Do you ever think about what you'd say to him if you found him? Harper asked. Michael thought for a moment. I'd tell him I'm sorry, and that I want to make things right, if he'd let me. Harper nodded slowly. Maybe you should try. Sometimes people surprise you. Michael looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. Maybe. As the night wore on, Michael brought out a blanket from the staff closet and handed it to Harper. It's not much, but it's better than nothing, he said. Harper took it, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment. Thanks, she said, her voice softer now. Michael turned off the library lights, leaving only the faint glow of a desk lamp to light the room. As he walked toward the door, he glanced back at Harper, who was already settling under the blanket. Good night, Harper, he said. Good night, Michael, she replied, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth. That night, as Michael lay in bed, he found himself thinking not just about Harper's story, but about his own. Maybe Harper was right. Maybe it wasn't too late to reach out, to try to fix what had been broken. And maybe, just maybe, helping her find her way could help him find his too. The library was bustling the next morning when Michael arrived. He noticed Harper still on the bench, her suitcase neatly tucked beside her, a book opens in her lap. She looked more at ease, her shoulders less tense than they had been the previous day. Michael offered her a small nod as he passed, relieved to see her settling into the space. But not everyone shared his sentiment. By late morning, whispers began to ripple through the library. Michael noticed a cluster of regular patrons, including Mrs. Turner and Kyle, exchanging glances and hushed remarks. He caught the occasional glance in Harper's direction, the disapproving frowns making his stomach twist. He tried to ignore it, but by midday, the murmurs had escalated into audible complaints. Michael, Mrs. Turner said, approaching the front desk with her arms crossed. Her tone was tight, her expression sharper than usual. I think it's time we talked about her. She nodded toward Harper, who sat obliviously flipping through her book. Michael felt his stomach drop. What about her? Mrs. Turner sighed dramatically, her voice loud enough for others nearby to hear. This is a library, not a shelter. People come here to read, to study, not to witness whatever this is. Kyle chimed in from behind her, smirking. Yeah, Michael, it's starting to look like she's moved in. Not exactly professional, is it? Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. She's not bothering anyone, he said firmly. That's not the point, Mrs. Turner snapped. People are starting to talk. It's not a good look for the library. Michael glanced over at Harper, who had finally noticed the commotion. Her eyes met his, and he saw the familiar flicker of guardedness returning. She looked like she was bracing for the worst. She's my guest, Michael said, keeping his tone steady. And she has just as much right to be here as anyone else. Mrs. Turner scoffed. Your guest? Don't you think that's a little inappropriate? Kyle smirked again, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Yeah, Michael. What's next? Free rooms for all. Harper stood abruptly, her book falling to the floor with a soft thud. It's fine, she said, her voice cold and clipped. I'll leave. Michael turned to her, panic rising. Harper, wait. I said it's fine, she interrupted, grabbing her suitcase. Her expression was blank, but Michael could see the hurt behind her eyes. I've overstayed my welcome. She walked briskly toward the exit, her suitcase wobbling on its damaged wheel. Harper, please, Michael started, but she was already gone, the door swinging shut behind her. The library felt unnaturally quiet after Harper left, the tension hanging thick in the air. Michael turned to Mrs. Turner and Kyle, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Are you happy now? He asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Mrs. Turner raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. Michael, we're just looking out for the library's reputation. You can't save everyone. Michael's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Maybe not, he said, his voice low. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Turner and Kyle to exchange puzzled glances. Michael spent the rest of the day distracted, his mind racing with thoughts of Harper. He replayed the scene over and over, each time feeling the sting of her departure more acutely. By the time the library closed, he was barely able to focus, his concern for Harper overshadowing everything else. He locked up quickly and headed into the cool evening air, determined to find her. The streets were quieter now, the fading light casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Michael checked the nearby park first, his eyes scanning the benches and paths for any sign of Harper. Harper, he called, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. There was no response. He continued walking, checking alleyways and bus stops, growing more anxious with each passing minute. Finally, he spotted her near the edge of town, sitting on a low stone wall with her suitcase at her feet. Harper, he said, relief washing over him as he approached. She looked up, her expression wary. What are you doing here? I was worried about you, Michael admitted. Harper shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. You didn't have to come after me. I told you I'd leave. Michael stepped closer, his voice gentle. You didn't have to. None of that was fair to you. Harper scoffed. Fair? Michael, nothing about my life has been fair. You should have just let me go. I couldn't, he said simply. They stood in silence for a moment, the distant sound of traffic filling the space between them. Finally, Harper sighed and sat back down on the wall. Why do you care so much? She asked, her voice quieter now. Michael hesitated, then sat beside her. Because I know what it's like to lose someone, and I don't want to lose you too. Harper frowned, her expression softening slightly. You barely know me. Maybe, Michael said, but I know enough to see that you're worth helping. Harper looked away, her fingers gripping the edge of the stone wall. You're too good for this world, Michael. You know that. Michael smiled faintly. I don't know about that, but I do know I'm not giving up on you. For the first time, Harper's expression cracked, a glimmer of emotion breaking through her guarded facade. She wiped at her eyes quickly, as if embarrassed. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Michael reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to figure it out alone. We'll figure it out together. Harper nodded slowly, her walls crumbling just a little more. They walked back to the library together, the silence between them now comfortable rather than tense. Michael opened the door and gestured for Harper to enter. Welcome back, he said with a small smile. Harper hesitated, then stepped inside. Thanks, she murmured. Michael locked the door behind them, the weight of the day finally lifting. As Harper settled on the bench again, Michael brought her a blanket and a fresh cup of tea. She accepted them without protest, her expression softer now. Good night, Harper, Michael said as he turned off the lights. Good night, Michael, she replied, her voice carrying a hint of warmth. That night, as Michael lay in bed, he felt a newfound determination settle over him. Harper's journey wasn't over, and neither was his. Together, they would face whatever came next one step at a time. The following day brought a crisp breeze and bright sunlight streaming through the library's windows. Michael arrived early, unlocking the doors and tidying the lobby as usual. Harper was still asleep on the bench, curled under the blanket he had given her the night before. He hesitated, not wanting to wake her, but a soft knock on the glass door startled them both. Harper stirred, sitting up groggily, while Michael turned to see Sandra, the waitress from the diner, standing outside with a to-go bag in her hands. Michael opened the door, surprised. "Sandra? What brings you here?" Sandra smiled warmly, holding up the bag. "I saw you two at the diner yesterday, and I couldn't stop thinking about her. Thought I'd drop off some breakfast. Figured she could use it." Michael blinked, momentarily stunned by her thoughtfulness. "That's really kind of you. Thank you." Sandra waved him off. "It's nothing. We all need a little help sometimes, right?" Michael nodded, a small smile forming. "You're right." Harper watched the exchange from the bench, her brow furrowed as Michael brought the bag over. "Here," he said, setting it beside her. "Sandra from the diner brought this for you." Harper's eyes widened slightly. "Why?" Michael shrugged. "Because she cares." Harper hesitated, then opened the bag to find a warm breakfast sandwich, an apple, and a small carton of orange juice. For a moment, she just stared at it, as if trying to process the gesture. "She didn't have to do this," Harper murmured, her voice low. "No," Michael agreed, "but she wanted to, and sometimes that's enough." Harper nodded slowly, unwrapping the sandwich. "Tell her thank you." "I don't know how to do that without sounding weird." Michael chuckled. "I'll let her know." As the morning progressed, Harper seemed quieter than usual, her gaze often drifting toward the windows as if lost in thought. Michael gave her space, though he couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in her demeanor. Around midday, Harper finally spoke up. "Michael." He looked up from the desk, where he'd been sorting through a stack of returns. "Yeah, I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her tone hesitant. "About finding something more stable." Michael set the books down, giving her his full attention. "And?" Harper fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. "I'm not saying I'm ready to dive into anything, but maybe it's time I tried." A small smile tugged at Michael's lips. "That's a big step, Harper." She shrugged, though her expression betrayed her nervousness. "I don't even know where to start. I mean, who's going to hire someone like me?" "Someone will," Michael said confidently. "We just have to find the right place." That afternoon, Michael pulled out an old laptop he kept in the staff room and set it up at a table. Together, they browsed local job listings, though Harper remained skeptical about most of them. "What about this one?" Michael asked, pointing to a listing for a part-time position at a community center. Harper read the description, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Organizing programs for kids? I don't know. I'm not exactly the maternal type." "You don't have to be," Michael said. "It's about helping them stay engaged and giving them a safe space. You're good at staying calm under pressure, and you've already proven you can handle tough situations." Harper raised an eyebrow. "You're basing that on me not running out screaming?" Michael chuckled. "I'm basing it on how you've handled everything life has thrown at you so far." She considered this for a moment before nodding. "Fine, I'll think about it." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Harper leaned back in her chair, her fingers rubbing her temples. "This is exhausting," she muttered. Michael glanced at her, his expression sympathetic. "It's a lot, I know, but you're making progress." Harper sighed, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "If you say so." Before Michael could respond, the library's door opened, and Sandra walked in, holding another to-go bag. "Hey there," she said, her smile bright. "Sandra?" Michael said, surprised. "Back again?" Sandra nodded, setting the bag on the desk. "Thought I'd bring dinner this time. Hope you don't mind." Harper stared at her, her expression a mix of gratitude and confusion. "You didn't have to do that." Sandra shrugged. "I know, but I wanted to. You remind me of someone I used to know." Harper tilted her head. "Who?" Sandra's smile faltered slightly. "My sister. She went through a rough patch a few years back. Took her a long time to get back on her feet, but she made it. I guess seeing you made me think of her." Harper's lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. Finally, she managed, "Thank you for everything." Sandra reached out and gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "You're welcome. And if you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me." With that, Sandra left, leaving a warm silence in her wake. Harper looked down at the bag of food, her expression unreadable. Why are people like that? She asked suddenly. Like what? Michael asked. Kind. When they don't have to be, Harper said, her voice tinged with confusion. Michael smiled faintly. Because they've been there too. Or maybe they just want to make the world a little better. Either way, it's worth accepting when it happens. Harper nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the bag. I don't think I've ever had this many people care about me before. Well, Michael said, his tone gentle, get used to it. Because you're not alone anymore. That night, Harper fell asleep on the library bench, her breathing steady and her expression more peaceful than Michael had seen before. As he locked up and prepared to leave, Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of hope growing in his chest. Harper had a long way to go, but with each small step, she was moving closer to something better. And Michael knew he would be there for every step of the journey. The next morning, Harper woke earlier than usual, stirred by the soft sounds of books being shelved and the faint hum of activity. She blinked against the morning sunlight streaming through the library's large windows and sat up, smoothing the blanket draped over her shoulders. Michael was already at work, arranging a cart of books nearby. Good morning, he said with a warm smile, pausing his task. Morning, Harper replied, her voice still groggy. She stretched, her movements slow as the weight of the previous day lingered. Michael wheeled the cart closer. Feel up to a little project today? Harper raised an eyebrow. What kind of project? Michael gestured to a stack of posters on the front desk. I'm organizing a community book drive. We're collecting books to donate to shelters and schools around town. I thought maybe you'd like to help me get everything ready. Harper hesitated, glancing at the posters. You want me to help with that? Why not? Michael asked, his tone casual. You've got a good eye for detail. And who knows? It might be fun. Harper snorted softly. I don't think I've been accused of being fun in a long time. Michael grinned. Well, there's a first time for everything. The morning passed quickly as Harper and Michael worked side by side, sorting books and preparing flyers. Harper surprised herself by how easily she fell into the rhythm of the task. She even found herself cracking a small smile when Michael made a joke about the ridiculously outdated covers of some donated romance novels. As they worked, patrons filtered in and out of the library. Some noticed the posters and stopped to chat with Michael about the book drive, their enthusiasm adding energy to the room. Harper kept to the background, content to listen, but she couldn't help feeling a flicker of pride when Michael mentioned her involvement. Harper's been a huge help, Michael told one patron, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile. I couldn't do this without her. Harper's cheeks flushed at the praise, and she busied herself with stacking books to avoid meeting the woman's gaze. By early afternoon, the library had grown busier, the buzz of activity a welcome change from the quiet tension of the previous days. Harper was in the middle of organizing a display when Michael approached her, holding a clipboard. Ready for the next step? He asked. Depends, Harper said, raising an eyebrow. What's the next step? Michael held out the clipboard. We're going to reach out to local businesses and see if they'll let us put up some posters. You game? Harper hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the clipboard. You want me to talk to people? Not by yourself, Michael assured her. We'll go together. It'll be good practice for those people skills you keep insisting you don't have. Harper smirked despite herself. Fine, but if anyone gives me a hard time, I'm blaming you. Fair enough, Michael said with a grin. The two of them spent the afternoon visiting nearby shops and cafes, explaining the book drive and asking for permission to hang posters. To Harper's surprise, most people were receptive, their willingness to help reminding her of the unexpected kindness Sandra had shown. At one small bookstore, the owner not only agreed to put up a poster, but also offered to donate several boxes of unsold books. You're really doing something good here, the owner said, handing Michael a pen to sign a donation slip. I wish more people thought about giving back. Harper glanced at Michael, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name stirring in her chest. She had always been skeptical of people's motives, but Michael's quiet determination and genuine kindness were starting to chip away at that. When they returned to the library, Harper sank into a chair, exhausted but oddly satisfied. You did great today, Michael said, setting the stack of donation forms on the desk. Harper shrugged. though a small smile tugged at her lips. It wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be. Michael chuckled. High praise. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. As the afternoon wore on, the library quieted again. Michael busied himself with organizing the newly donated books, while Harper sat at the front desk, absently flipping through one of the paperbacks they'd collected. Her thoughts drifted to the community center job Michael had shown her earlier. She hadn't dismissed the idea entirely, though the prospect of putting herself out there still made her nervous. Michael, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. He looked up from the bookshelf. Yeah, do you really think I could do something like that? Work at a place like the community center? Michael set down the book in his hands and walked over, leaning against the desk. I don't think it. I know it. Harper frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of the paperback. What if I screw it up? What if they take one look at me and decide I'm not worth it? Michael's expression softened. Harper, you've already proven you're worth it. The way you handled everything today? That's exactly what they're looking for, someone who cares, someone who doesn't give up. Harper stared at him, her defenses faltering. You make it sound so easy. It's not, Michael admitted. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. The day ended with a sense of accomplishment that Harper hadn't felt in a long time. As she prepared to settle on the library bench for the night, Michael approached with a small, folded piece of paper. What's this? Harper asked, taking it. It's the contact info for the community center, Michael said. They're looking for someone now, so I thought maybe you'd want to give them a call. Harper stared at the paper, her fingers tightening around it. You really don't give up, do you? Michael smiled. Not when it comes to you. That night, Harper lay awake on the bench, staring at the folded paper in her hand. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine something more, a life where she wasn't just surviving, but living. And for the first time, it didn't seem completely out of reach. The library buzzed with energy the next day as donations poured in for the book drive. Patrons stopped by to drop off boxes of books, and Michael's enthusiasm seemed to spread to everyone involved. Harper found herself unexpectedly swept up in the momentum, her reluctance giving way to cautious optimism. By midday, she was helping Michael sort through a particularly large donation when the sound of the front door swinging open caught her attention. Harper glanced up, her heart skipping a beat as she locked eyes with a man she thought she'd never see again. Aaron. He stood in the doorway, his frame tall and imposing. His familiar smirk sent a chill down her spine, instantly bringing back memories she had fought so hard to bury. What are you doing here? Harper demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. Michael looked up from the table, his brow furrowing as he noticed the tension in her posture. He stood quickly, stepping closer to Harper's side. Relax, Aaron said, raising his hands in mock innocence. I just came to talk. Harper narrowed her eyes, her fists clenching at her sides. I have nothing to say to you. Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You need to leave. Aaron's smirk faltered as he turned his attention to Michael. And who are you? Her knight in shining armor. Something like that, Michael replied evenly. Whatever you think you're doing, it's not welcome here. Aaron's eyes flicked between them, his smirk returning. This is cute. Really. But Harper and I have unfinished business. No, we don't, Harper said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. The tension in the room was thick, the quiet of the library amplifying every word. Michael took a step closer to Aaron, his gaze unwavering. You heard her. Leave. Now. Aaron's expression darkened, but after a moment he shrugged. Fine, I'll go. But this isn't over. He turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. Harper let out a shaky breath, her knees threatening to buckle. Michael was by her side in an instant, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. Are you okay? He asked softly. Harper nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the door. I didn't think I'd ever see him again. Michael guided her to a nearby chair, his voice calm and reassuring. You don't have to deal with him alone. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Harper tried to focus on the book drive, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Aaron. His sudden appearance had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. That evening, after the library had closed, Michael found her sitting on the bench, her head in her hands. "You've been quiet," he said, sitting beside her. Harper sighed, her voice heavy with frustration. "I thought I was past this. Past him." But seeing him again, she trailed off, shaking her head. "It's normal to feel that way," Michael said gently. "He hurt you, and seeing him brings all of that back. But you're stronger now, Harper. You've already come so far." Harper looked at him, her eyes glistening. "What if he doesn't leave me alone? What if he tries to find me again?" Michael's expression hardened. "Then we'll deal with it. Together. You're not alone in this." His words were like a balm, soothing the fear that had taken root in her chest. Harper nodded slowly, her breathing steadying. The next morning, Michael made a call to a lawyer he knew through the library's community network. By the time Harper arrived, he had a plan in place. "We need to make sure Aaron can't come near you again," Michael said as they sat at the front desk. "Filing a restraining order would be a good start." Harper hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. "I don't know, Michael. What if it just makes things worse?" "It won't," Michael said firmly. "The law is on your side, and so am I." Harper looked at him, the determination in his eyes sparking a flicker of hope in her chest. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's do it." The process wasn't easy. Harper had to recount her experiences with Aaron in painful detail, but Michael was there every step of the way, offering quiet support and reassurance. By the time they left the lawyer's office, Harper felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she could take control of her life. That evening, Harper sat at the library's front desk, staring at the contact information for the community center job Michael had given her. "Thinking about calling them?" Michael asked, sitting beside her. Harper nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I'm ready." Michael smiled, his pride evident. "That's great, Harper. You're going to do amazing things." With Michael's encouragement, Harper picked up the phone and dialed the number. The conversation was brief, but positive. The community center was interested in her background and invited her to an interview the following week. When she hung up, Harper looked at Michael, her expression a mix of nerves and excitement. "I can't believe I just did that." Michael grinned. "I can. You're stronger than you think." As the night settled over the library, Harper felt a renewed sense of hope. Aaron's return had shaken her, but it had also shown her how much she had grown and how much support she had in Michael. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so daunting. The morning of Harper's interview dawned bright and clear, but her nerves were anything but steady. She sat on the library bench, staring down at the neatly folded outfit Michael had helped her pick out the night before. Simple blouse and slacks borrowed from a donation box at a nearby church. "You're going to do great," Michael said, standing at the desk with a stack of books. His calm, reassuring tone was becoming a constant in her life. Harper forced a small smile. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one walking in there and trying to convince people you're worth hiring." Michael set the books aside and walked over, sitting beside her. "Harper, listen to me. You're capable, you're resilient, and you have more to offer than you realize. The fact that you're even doing this proves how far you've come." She let out a shaky breath, nodding. "Okay, I'll try not to freak out." Michael smiled. "That's all I'm asking. And remember, no matter what happens, I'm proud of you." An hour later, Harper found herself standing outside the community center, her palms damp as she smoothed her blouse. The building was modest but inviting, with cheerful posters decorating the windows. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, greeted her warmly and guided her to a small office where the interview would take place. "Harper," said a man as he rose from behind the desk to shake her hand. He was in his early 50s, with a friendly smile and a calm demeanor. "I'm James, the program director. Thanks for coming in." "Thank you for having me," Harper said, her voice steadier than she expected. The interview started with basic questions about her background and availability, but as it progressed, James asked more about her motivations. "What made you interested in working here?" he asked. Harper hesitated, the weight of her past suddenly pressing down on her. She thought of Michael's encouragement, his belief in her when she couldn't believe in herself. Taking a deep breath, she decided to speak honestly. "Because I know what it's like to need a safe place," she said. "I've been in situations where I didn't have that, and I know how much it can mean to someone. I want to give back to help others find the stability and support I didn't have for a long time." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a powerful motivation, and it sounds like you've been through a lot. How do you think those experiences will shape your approach to this role?" Harper straightened, the words coming more easily now. "I think they'll help me connect with people. I know what it feels like to be overlooked or judged, and I don't want anyone to feel that way when they walk through these doors. I want them to feel seen and valued." James smiled, leaning back in his chair. "I appreciate your honesty, Harper. That kind of perspective is exactly what we're looking for." The interview ended on a positive note, with James promising to follow up soon. As Harper stepped outside, she felt an unfamiliar sensation bubbling up inside her hope. She pulled out her phone and dialed Michael's number. "Well?" Michael answered after the first ring, his voice eager. "I think it went okay," Harper said, her tone almost disbelieving. "He seemed impressed?" Michael laughed, relief evident in his voice. "Of course he was. I told you, you're incredible." Harper shook her head, smiling. "I wouldn't have done it without you." "You did this, Harper," Michael said firmly. "All I did was remind you of what you're capable of." Over the next few days, Harper threw herself into helping Michael with the book drive while waiting to hear back from the community center. The steady rhythm of sorting and organizing gave her a sense of purpose, a welcome distraction from her nerves. The book drive's success exceeded all expectations, with donations pouring in from local businesses and residents alike. On the final day of the drive, Harper stood beside Michael as they loaded the last box of books into a delivery van headed for a local shelter. "This feels good," Harper admitted, watching the van drive away. Michael nodded, his expression warm. Helping others has a way of doing that. That evening, Harper received the call she'd been waiting for. "Harper, it's James," the voice on the other end of the line said. "I'm thrilled to let you know we'd like to offer you the position." Harper's breath caught. "Really? That's amazing. Thank you so much." James chuckled. "We're lucky to have you. I'll email you the details, and we'll see you Monday for your first day." When the call ended, Harper sat in stunned silence, the words replaying in her mind. "Michael," she called, her voice cracking with emotion. He appeared from the staff room, concern flashing across his face. "What is it? Are you okay?" Harper stood, a wide grin spreading across her face. "I got the job." Michael's face lit up, his smile as bright as hers. "Harper, that's incredible. I knew you could do it." She laughed, a sound that felt foreign but freeing. "I can't believe it. I actually did it." Michael pulled her into a quick hug, his pride evident. "You earned this, Harper. I'm so proud of you." That night, as Harper lay on the library bench, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: stability. For the first time, her future felt less like an abstract dream and more like a reality within her grasp. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but with Michael's unwavering support and the new opportunity before her, she felt ready to face them. Harper smiled to herself as she drifted off to sleep, the folded piece of paper with her new job details tucked securely in her bag. Monday morning arrived with crisp air and golden sunlight streaming through the windows of the library. Harper sat on the bench, her nerves fluttering but tempered by the quiet confidence she had been building. She smoothed her blouse, the same one she'd worn for the interview, and glanced at Michael, who stood at the desk sorting through papers. "Big day," he said with a grin, glancing over at her. Harper smiled, though her fingers fidgeted with the strap of her bag. "Yeah, feels strange, you know? Like this isn't really happening." Michael walked over and sat beside her. "It's happening, Harper. You've worked for this, and you deserve it. Just take it one step at a time, like you always do." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thanks, Michael, for everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice soft. "You've done the hard part. Now it's time to show them what you're capable of." Harper's first day at the community center began quietly. James greeted her warmly when she arrived, introducing her to the staff and walking her through the building. The center buzzed with activity, children's laughter echoing from the playroom, and the hum of conversation filling the air. "We're excited to have you here," James said as they stopped by her new desk. "There's a lot to do, but I know you're up for the challenge." Harper smiled, her nerves easing slightly. "I'll do my best." Her first task was to help plan an upcoming event, a weekend program for families in the community. As she worked alongside her new co-workers, she found herself slipping into a rhythm. She was surprised by how natural it felt to contribute her ideas and coordinate details. By the end of the day, Harper felt a sense of pride she hadn't experienced in years. As she packed up her things, James approached her with a smile. "Great work today, Harper," he said. "You're going to make a big difference here. I can already tell." Her chest swelled with a mix of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, James. That means a lot." That evening, Harper returned to the library to share the news with Michael. He was waiting for her at the front desk, a knowing smile on his face as she walked in. "Well," he asked, leaning forward. "It was amazing," Harper said, her grin spreading wide. "I actually felt like I belonged there." Michael beamed. "Of course you did. I'm so proud of you, Harper." Her smile softened, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You could have," Michael said gently. "But I'm glad I got to help." As the weeks went by, Harper settled into her new role at the community center. The work was challenging but rewarding, and she found herself growing more confident with each passing day. The connections she made with the staff and the families who visited the center filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Michael, too, noticed the change in her. The guarded, wary woman who had first walked into the library was now someone who stood taller, spoke with more certainty, and smiled more freely. One evening, after a particularly successful day at the center, Harper returned to the library to find Michael setting up chairs for a small event, a community meeting to discuss expanding the book drive into an ongoing literacy program. "You're really going all in with this?" Harper said, leaning against the doorframe. Michael looked up, smiling. "It's worth it. Just like you said, helping others find a safe space can make all the difference." Harper walked over, her smile warm. "I guess you taught me a thing or two about that." As they worked together to arrange the chairs, Harper glanced at Michael, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about what you said, about reaching out to people." Michael straightened, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then said, "Your brother. You said you wanted to make things right with him. Have you thought about trying?" Michael paused, her words hitting him with a quiet intensity. "I have," he admitted, "but I guess I've been scared. What if it's too late?" "It's not," Harper said firmly. "Trust me, I know what it's like to feel like you've burned every bridge. But if someone like me can find a second chance, so can he." Michael studied her, a smile tugging at his lips. "You're right. Maybe it's time." A few days later, Michael made the call. To his relief, his brother Eric picked up, and their conversation, though hesitant at first, quickly turned into something deeper. By the time Michael hung up, he felt a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying begin to lift. When he shared the news with Harper, her smile was genuine and bright. "See? Told you it wasn't too late." Michael chuckled. "You're starting to sound like me." As the weeks turned into months, Harper's life continued to blossom. She moved into a small apartment near the community center, a place of her own for the first time in years. Michael visited often, and their friendship deepened into something neither of them had expected but both cherished. One quiet evening, as they sat in Harper's tiny but cozy living room, sipping coffee, she looked at him with a mix of gratitude and affection. "You changed my life, Michael," she said softly. "I hope you know that." Michael shook his head, his smile warm. "You changed your life, Harper. I just gave you a little push." Their paths had crossed in the most unexpected way, but together they had built something stronger than either of them could have imagined, a foundation of trust, resilience, and hope. And for both Michael and Harper, the future no longer felt like something to fear. It was a bridge, built one step at a time, leading to something brighter than either of them could have dreamed. Their paths had crossed in the most unexpected way, but together they had built something stronger than either of them could have imagined, a foundation of trust, resilience, and hope. For both Michael and Harper, the future no longer felt like something to fear. It was a bridge, built one step at a time, leading to something brighter than either of them could have dreamed. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales about courage, kindness, and second chances. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story, because sometimes The smallest acts of compassion can spark the greatest changes. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.